Even though school books don't talk about it much, slavery was really important in New York's early days. The idea of freedom for Americans came partly from dealing with slavery. The people in history who talked about liberty usually had enslaved people in chains right next to them. We believe in the philosophical notion that if you want to understand the present, you have to start by understanding the past. So, what's the past? During the construction of the Federal Office Tower in downtown Manhattan, they found the remains of more than 400 enslaved people in graves. About 40% of these were kids under 15 years old. Most of them had died because they didn't have enough food. The grown-up skeletons showed that many of them had died from really hard work that never stopped. Their muscles and bones were so strained that their muscles were tearing away from their bones, which caused a lot of pain. This sad discovery wasn't unusual. It showed that New York was deeply involved in the slave trade and slavery. Some of the important people in New York, like the ones who traded things and handled money, made money directly from helping with the Atlantic slave trade. Around 1720, half of the ships leaving New York were part of the trade, where they took slaves to the Caribbean. They would sell these enslaved people in auctions, which happened every week, sometimes even every day, at a place called the Wall Street Slave Market. They used to put ads in newspapers to let people know about these auctions. Important Dutch families like the Philipses were involved, and others had business connections with the British Caribbean colonies. By the middle of the 1700s, this Philipses family owned more than 52,000 acres of land in Westchester County and had a lot of enslaved people, even after the intentional slave trade was made illegal. Enslaved Africans were brought to what later became New York as part of the Dutch slave trade. The Dutch West India Company brought 11 African slaves to New Amsterdam in 1626. The first auction where they sold slaves happened in New Amsterdam in 1655. By 1703, more than 42% of households in New York City had slaves. These slaves often worked as servants, laborers, artisans, or in different jobs like shipping and trade. They also worked on farms in places like Long Island, the Hudson Valley, and the Mohawk Valley. During the American Revolutionary War, the British took control of New York City in 1776. They made a promise called the Philipsburg Proclamation, saying that slaves who left their rebel owners would be free. Many slaves sought refuge with the British, and thousands went to the city. Around 10,000 black people were living in New York by 1780. Most of them were former slaves who had escaped from owners in both the northern and southern colonies. After the war, in 1780, the British took about 3,000 slaves from New York. They moved most of them to Nova Scotia to live as free people. These people are now known as Black Loyalists. Moving on. Lawmakers in New York tried to keep enslaved people from interacting too much. They made rules to control the freedom that enslaved people had in terms of culture, social life, and politics. The owners of enslaved people were most afraid that if their slaves got educated and became Christian, they might want to be free. There are records showing that in the 1600s, in New Amsterdam, enslaved Africans asked together to be paid for their work. As time went on, under British control, slavery got stricter, and the slaves started resisting more. But how did they do it? They stole money, clothes, and food from their owners and ran away more often than before. In 1712, about 24 slaves rebelled by setting fires on the edges of the city and killing the first white people who came to help. This led to cruel public punishments, like burning people alive or breaking their bodies on wheels. The government made tough laws about slavery, setting up special courts for slaves and making it hard for owners to set slaves free. In 1741, there was talk of a great Negro plot, which means a big plan made by enslaved black people. But historians aren't completely sure about the details. This led to more punishment and even stricter slave laws. Because of this, Very few black people in New York became free through legal ways before the time of the American Revolution. The punishments were awful, like public hangings and cutting off heads. Some rebels were put in iron cages while alive, burned alive, or had their bodies broken on wheels. All of this was meant to show the power of white people over black people and to scare the enslaved into submission. Surprisingly, some slaves still tried to fight back even though it seemed like they would die. Were these people so desperate that they preferred dying to being enslaved? Or did they believe they could beat white people's control? These are important questions to think about. Be free to share your thoughts in the comment section of what you think. Now, New York City was a crucial way station to the metropolitan corridor through which fugitive slaves made their way from the Upper South through Philadelphia and to the upstate New York, New England, and Canada. I'm talking about the Underground Railroad. Was a hidden group of people who wanted to stop slavery. They helped black Americans run away from being slaves in the southern part of the United States to go to the free states in the north or to Canada. The Underground Railroad was the biggest movement against slavery in North America. It helped around 30,000 to 40,000 escaped slaves reach a place called British North America, which is Canada now. There were many popular routes. Some went west through Ohio to Indiana and Iowa. Others went north through Pennsylvania and into New England, or they went through Detroit on their way to Canada. So, in the southern part of the United States, there was a law called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. This law made it a profitable business to catch slaves who had escaped, and there were fewer places where these escaped slaves could hide. When they ran away, they often had to go quite a distance before finding safe spots. People called conductors helped the escaped slaves on their journey. They found places for them to stay, like private homes, churches, and school buildings. These places were called stations, safe houses, or depots. The people who managed these spots were called station masters. And speaking of conductors, women were important conductors on the Underground Railroad. In New York City, a significant place was the Colored Sailors' Home. There, a woman named Mary Marshall Lyons, who was the owner's wife, helped over 1,000 refugees by giving them food and helping them hide. And in a black community called Weeksville, the special way people lived there helped escaped slaves. Brooklyn was also a special place because it was full of people who were against slavery. It had important pastors, writers, activists, and others who played a big part in the fight for freedom. From daring escapes to secret safe houses,